Next is our diary talk for this year. For those of you who are not familiar what I mean by diary talk, we normally have one major talk on the history of astronomy a year at these ordinary meetings, and this is today's talk, is this diary talk about Herschel 2022, a double anniversary, and it's going to be given by Dr. Patricia Fara, who is an emeritus fellow of Clare College, Cambridge, where she was senior tutor for 10 years. I hope I've got that right. She originally read physics at Oxford, but then saw the error of her ways, and now is in the History and Philosophy of Science department at Cambridge. In addition to her academic teaching, many of you know she's written many popular books and articles and was awarded the 2022 Abraham Price Prize by the American Physical Society.
Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me to give this talk. It's a great honor. And these are the two people that I'm going to be talking about. William Herschel on the left, Caroline Herschel on the right. They were brother and sister, and they were both astronomers. This is a very romanticized, imaginary 19th century picture. And you can see on the shelf at the top above the books, there's a sort of like a potted history of astronomy, and there's a conventional telescope in the middle. And there is William Herschel's giant telescope, which was revolutionary at the time. Of course, it's William Herschel's anniversary, which is the more famous. It's exactly 200 years since he died, and you can see him here looking like a very romantic hero. And he was the first president of the Royal Astronomical Society, to which you all belong. And on his logo of the society, you can see a drawing of his telescope, the giant 40-foot telescope that was based at Slough. And the Latin around the edge, which I won't attempt to read, means whatever shines should be observed. And this is a bit corny, but the society recognized that although women weren't allowed in the society, William's sister Caroline also shone like a star. James South, vice president at the time, awarded her the gold medal. He said, "Who participated in his toils? Who braved with him the inclemency of the weather? Who shared his privations? A female. Who was she? His sister." And like William Herschel, James South is famous for looking at double stars. But it's also an anniversary for Caroline Herschel. She arrived in England from Germany exactly 250 years ago. And in 1822, when her brother died, she went back to Germany. There aren't very many pictures of her, and the ones that they are rather like this. They're very sort of stereotyped little old lady with her knitting needles, very different from the romantic picture of William Herschel. And she's been largely overlooked in the history of astronomy until fairly recently, because historians traditionally like to tell stories about the past as a succession of great male geniuses making mega discoveries. And Herschel fits in very well into this. So this is a sculpture from the Griffith Observatory, and you can see in the middle, there's Isaac Newton, so holding an apple, I assume, and that's Kepler on the right, and William Herschel on the left. So it was in 1781 that William Herschel made what is now his most famous discovery, what we now know as the planet Uranus. He was convinced for several weeks that it was a comet. So 13th of March, perhaps a comet. 2nd of April, yeah, absolutely sure. Saw the diameter of the comet, extremely well defined, a glorious sight. And eventually people became convinced that it was a planet, and William Herschel called it King George's star, because King George III was his major patron. William never adopted the name Uranus, and it wasn't really to the 19th century that was adopted generally. So Herschel was very keen to ingratiate himself with the king. That's why he called it the King George's star, because there weren't any grants for astronomers at university, there were no research programs, there was no funding, and so he relied on his patron. So sorry, there's a picture of Uranus. And so when he was building his 40-foot telescope at Slough, I've shown it on the left at Greenwich, so you can see the scale of it. The tube was lying on the ground, and it was Caroline Herschel's responsibility to show the tube to visitors. And George III himself came to look at it, and he apparently said to the Archbishop of Canterbury, "Come, my Lord Bishop, I will show you the way to heaven." So Caroline's responsibilities included taking around the distinguished visitors. She also looked after the visitors' book. This is in her handwriting, and so you can see some of the very distinguished people, and General Paoli, and then Cavallo, who was a physicist based in London. But that keeping the visitors' book was just one of her many tasks, which were both administrative and running the house and astronomical. And she was so sort of distinguished an astronomer that when the king, just George III, awarded William Herschel £400 a year for his astronomical work, the king also awarded Caroline £50 per year, which was the first stipend that was ever paid to a scientific woman. And it might not sound very much, but it was quite an achievement. So William's taken a lot of the credit, but he actually set up a large sort of family enterprise with many, many employees, some of whom were his brothers. So on the left at the bottom, you can see the 40-foot telescope at Slough that I showed you before. The picture above, I'm afraid, isn't building that telescope. It's building one of Hevelius's telescopes, because I couldn't find a picture of the Slough one, but I just wanted to sort of impress upon you, as I'm sure you know, that building a telescope in those days was a pretty big undertaking. So Caroline Herschel called it a perfect chaos of business. And she was responsible for coordinating the workmen. There were about 30 or 40 workmen that were there for 3 months, just preparing the site. And they all wore numbered shirts so that she could tell them one for the other. And then there were the bricklayers, there were local carpenters, the blacksmiths, and the ironmongers, and she was trying to sort of coordinate all of that. And also when they actually got round to taking measurements, that, of course, was also a double act. So on the top, you can see the 20-foot telescope, which was at Slough, I think. It was either Slough or Datchet. And Caroline is on the ground recording his observations. But then when they built the 40-foot telescope at Slough, the big one, there's a little hut at the bottom, which you can see. And that's where she sat, and she was recording the measurements, and it was connected with by a speaking tube with William on that little platform sitting on the right at the top. So it's very much a double act. And although writing numbers down might sound quite easy, she then had the responsibility, as you can see on the left, of converting them into tables that could be used for compiling star catalogues. And as far as I can make out, by the time they'd finished observing all night, William rolled into bed and went to sleep, and she spent the morning doing all the calculations. There was also the physical labor. And only the year before, William had asked her to adjust a telescope, and she was having to run in the dark on ground covered foot deep with melting snow. I fell on one of these hooks, which entered my right leg about 6 inches above the knee. My brothers called, "Make haste." I could only answer by a pitiful cry, "I'm hooked." And there's lots of accounts of her stumbling around in the dark on snowy evenings. So William does, of course, deserve to be celebrated as a path-breaking astronomer, and I don't want to take away from his achievements or deny his importance. But in this lecture, I want to get away from the simplistic view of him as a lone genius and instead talk about how closely he worked with his sister. So they both came from Hanover. You can see in the map on the middle, that's the green bit. And at that stage, all the kings on the British throne were Hanoverians. At the time that William arrived, it was George II, but later on, it was George III. And William was experiencing some political difficulties in Hanover, and so he took refuge in England in 1757. And George III was very supportive of science in general and the Herschel telescope in particular. William was a very talented musician. When he first came over, he spent several years traveling around England, He was a composer. This is one of his symphonies. And he also played several different instruments. And then he moved to Bath, which was a very fashionable spa town. And he was very active in the music scene there. And he got a job as the chief organist. You can see the organ there at the new Octagon Chapel. And on the right is his house where they lived. It's now the Herschel Museum. A few years later, 1772, he invited Caroline to join him. And what the plan was that he was going to introduce her to a singing career as a soprano. And that all started off absolutely fine. You can see this is just one of the examples of a program of where she was performing. She did several solo performances. And then from her point of view, it all went horribly wrong because he got the bug for astronomy. So you can see this is the top floor of the museum at Bath, and there's the piano and her elegant dress, and there's a harp, but now they've been joined by a telescope and astronomical instruments. And her musical career completely fizzled out because she was obliged to work with him on his astronomical research. At the time, astronomy and music were far more closely linked than they are now, because traditionally in the medieval curriculum that was just being phased out, they were regarded as mathematical subjects that demanded specialized instruments. So the maths and the instruments they had in common. So this was the traditional arrangement of what we might call scientific related subjects: geometry, arithmetic, music, and astronomy. And even though the syllabus was in the process of changing, even someone like Isaac Newton still observed that old traditional link. When he originally looked at a spectrum of light, a rainbow, he saw, I think it was 5 colors in it, but he changed his mind and he said it had to be 7 colors because that corresponds with the musical scale as established by Pythagoras. And he had this view of sort of cosmic harmony. So it was a musical universe, so there had to be 7 colors in the rainbow. So the older attitudes took a long, long while to die out. So on the right, you can see the picture I showed you at the beginning, and William Herschel is busy polishing a mirror. And if you go down into the basement of the museum there, you can see the cellar where there's still an earthen floor, and that's where Caroline spent a lot of her time sieving horsemanure to make smooth mold, to pour the molten metal in, to make the mirrors. She was a very, very self-deprecating woman. She wrote several times versions of this quotation: "I am nothing. I have done nothing. A well-trained puppy dog would have done as much." And it sort of fits in with this 19th century picture where she's bringing him cups of tea as he's polishing, although in actual fact, he did have to spend many, many continuous hours polishing, and she did have to feed him. So these are replicas of the 7-foot telescope which they built at Bath. And beneath that, you can see replicas of the mirror grinders that they also used to help them construct the mirrors for the telescope. And later on, they moved near Slough, nearer Windsor, nearer the King, and they went on building larger and larger telescopes. So this 20-foot telescope was at Datchet. And these telescopes were seen as being very weird and revolutionary at the time because they had such wide mirrors that they could see far further out into space than conventional telescopes, and which meant that the Herschels could study the whole of the solar system. And they were seen as being very weird, but they also attracted a huge amount of interest. So for them, astronomy was rather like botany. You collect and you classify plants, you collect stars and you place them into groups. And both botany and astronomy were seen as suitable subjects for women. So William Herschel wrote, "The heavens resemble a luxuriant garden, which contains the great variety of productions in different flourishing beds." And they made several different collections. And on the right, there's one of William Herschel's collection of nebulas, which they both observed and collected. Another of his early successes was studying double stars, and this diagram, an all-sky star chart, shows all 805 all 805 confirmed observations by William Herschel. Caroline Herschel's speciality was collecting comets. And this diagram, the view through the telescope, the diagram and the notes from the notebook are all preserved in the archives of the Royal Society. And this was the first comet she ever saw. She wrote very, very tentatively to the Secretary of the Royal Society, "I venture to trouble you with the following imperfect account of a comet," very different from William Herschel's brash assurance that he'd seen a comet and it was actually a planet, that this really was a comet. And she became, as soon as people heard about this comet, her reputation and fame started spreading throughout the country. And a few weeks later, she was summoned to Windsor Castle. And there's a picture there of Fanny Burney at the bottom. Fanny Burney was best known as a novelist, but she was also one of the royal attendants. And she said, "It's the First Lady's comet, and I was very desirous to see it." So Fanny Burney and the king all mounted the steps and looked through the telescope at this lady's comet. So Caroline went on observing and recording for years. So these images are all from the Royal Society archive, Royal Astronomical Society's archives. And she found 8 new comets. And previously there were only 30 that there were known. So she had quite a substantial number. So observing wasn't always easy. So this is her report on the third one, which is now technically logged as C/17908A1 Herschel. So here's her comment. "I see an object like a star with a burr or round, a very strong fog prevents further observation." So she encountered lots of difficulties. But she scrupulously recorded the position of this comet to a second of accuracy so that she could make her claim of priority. Then a month later, she had become so famous that she was satirized. So here's Caroline Herschel, the female philosopher, smelling out the comet. This caricature combines 2 favorite types of crude joke in the Georgian period. One was the sexual connotations of telescopes, and the other was a scatological association with just about everything. And you can see a prominent mark on her left cheek, and that's probably a reference to smallpox and other illnesses that she had when she was little, which left her rather short and rather disabled and with a scarred face. Then on the ground, there's a discarded astronomical quadrant, and that's been superseded by the Herschel's handcrafted telescopes. So Caroline Herschel never became fluent in English. She always spoke with a strong German accent, and that's indicated by the words, which I know you can't read in the speech bubble. It says, "What a strong sulfurous scent proceeds from this meteor." That's why she smelt out the comet. And at that time, any flashing light in the sky was called a meteor, and that stemmed from Aristotle's classifications thousands of years earlier. And the caricature is also poking fun at William. You can see a man in the moon, and there's a naked, you can see on the right and on the left, you can see a naked boy squatting inside the sun. And that's because William had controversially suggested that there really is life on the moon. So that was not an uncommon belief. This is a diagram by Thomas Wright from the middle of the 18th century. And he believed that there were many celestial bodies and that many of them supported life. And the arguments about this were largely theological ones, because there were lots and lots and lots of objects in the heavens. So why else would God have created them? God must have created them for a purpose, and the purpose must be to support life. Going against that was a different argument. If you're Christian, you believe that Christ came to earth. So if there was life on all the other planets, why was the earth singled out for Christ to descend and be crucified? So those were the terms in which many of these debates were conducted. So this is a modern photo of William Herschel's crater on the moon. He claimed that the moon was inhabited from very early on in his life, although he was actually slightly worried about being dubbed a lunatic, he said. And he often claimed that the dark patches that you can see on the moon are woods. That means that it must be supporting life. And this was quite a common type of argument. Sometimes I think he got a bit carried away. So he said, I'm almost convinced that those numberless small surfaces we see on the moon are the works of lunarians and maybe called their towns. He later sort of rather regretted having said that. And he also said that there might be solarians on the sun. But he did, of course, make many more discoveries, which we would still consider valid today. He discovered infrared radiation by placing thermometers in different parts of the spectrum, refracted through a prism. And that's one of his diagrams from his original paper. So I've only got half an hour. I can't tell you everything about William and Caroline Herschel. I've been given very strict instructions to speak to time. But as you know, he died in 1822 as England's most famous astronomer, and he's still extremely famous. Her story ends a bit more sadly. She grew, after her brother, William, whom she absolutely adored, after he got married, she became increasingly embittered and solitary. And then as soon as he died, she went back to Germany, although she maintained a strong correspondence with her nephew, his son, John Herschel. And for much of her life, her diary is packed with miserable remarks, like the one about the puppy dog, that belittled herself and glorified her brother. And of course, from a modern woman's perspective, that's absolutely infuriating. And you sort of wish that she didn't do it. But I did detect one moment when there was a sort of flash of wit and rebellion. And that was when she once thanked the Astronomer Royal for having flattered her vanity by printing her star catalogue. So she started off sort of tying herself in knots, trying to say she was no different from any other woman, really. She was quite ordinary. You see, sir, I do owe myself to be vain, because I would not wish to be singular. And was there ever a woman without vanity? But then there's a great sting in the tail where I think all her resentment that must have been seething inside for years, her resentment shows through. Or a man either, only with this difference, that among gentlemen, the commodity is generally styled ambition. So that's the end of the talk.
Thank you very much to your introduction to these amazing people. How many people have been to the Herschel Museum in Bath? Right? How many people have not been to the Herschel Museum in Bath? Right? Well, I trust you're planning your summer holidays next year and that you'll do so. Yeah, I think you'll agree that it's well worth visiting.
Oh, it's
The RAS sort of has an interest there, and we regularly collaborate with exhibitions and so on through Sean, our librarian, and other people. So if you're ever there, thoroughly recommend you to go and have a look at that Herschel Museum. Questions? We've got one online.
This first question again comes from Adil Desai. And it's, so would you say Isaac Newton was not scientific in surmising that light consisted of 7 colors due to the connection with 7 musical notes, and later on Herschel discovered infrared rays in light?
So I noticed the questions posed very carefully. Would I say Isaac Newton isn't scientific? What I would not say is that he was a scientist, because I think the word scientist wasn't invented till 1833, and so you can't have a something that exists if there isn't a word to describe it. Isaac Newton was living well over 100 years earlier. The other reason I think why we might not call him scientific now is that he was a very deep believer in God. He was a really religious man. And the sort of edition that he wrote for the Principia in the 2nd edition of 1713 emphasizes that God is central to everything and that God is immanent throughout the universe. So I think there's many ways in which, by some criteria, I would say he's not scientific. On the other hand, it's a bit difficult to exclude him from the whole of science, because his theories obviously played a key role. And I mean, it's one of the problems of deciding when did science begin. I mean, you could say it began with Copernicus. You could say it began when William Whewell introduced the word scientist. But on the other hand, the history of science goes back at least to the Babylonians and to the Greeks. So what counts as science is constantly changing. So yes, in one sense, it's scientific. What Newton did seemed scientific, seemed rational at the time. It conformed with existing norms of knowledge, but it's not what we think now.
Another one online?
The next question is from Andrew Thomas, and it's, was a singing career realistic? Are there any
realistic?
A singing career?
Oh, a singing career, yeah.
And are there any reviews of the Bath concerts?
I think it was very realistic. I mean, the program sheet I told you that she was very successful. Bath was an excellent place to undertake that sort of work. You just have to read Jane Austen to know that there was a lot of singing going on. It is said that she wrote music herself, only unfortunately none of it survives. William Herschel's music, quite a lot of William Herschel's music does survive, and there's a man at the Royal Society whose ambition is to put on a William Herschel concert, and he hasn't quite done it yet. So perhaps the Royal Society and the Royal Astronomical Society could collaborate and have a William Herschel concert.
Well, actually.
Oh, actually, you already done that.
Done
Oh,
it.
I'm sorry, I didn't know that. I must say.
As part of the Herschel celebration.
Oh, you did that? I didn't
in
know.
Bath, there was indeed a concert.
Oh, okay.
And there was, I think, the one in York as well this
Okay.
year. So, and you can in fact buy CDs of William Herschel's music if you wish to.
Okay, well, Christmas is coming up, everybody.
Next question. Is there one in the room next? No, we'll take another one online then.
This question comes from Charles Draper, and he starts off with, thanks for the talk. Caroline is better recognised today and a great inspiration for many. We now have 2 astronomy prizes in her name. What else should be done in her name?
Oh, she has got a crater on Mars. No, is it Venus? I can't remember. Venus. She has got a crater somewhere that's named after her. Well, we just saw a picture of one of the Mars explorers that's named after Rosalind Franklin. Seeing Caroline, I mean, I don't want to downplay the importance of Rosalind Franklin, obviously, but Caroline Herschel was a famous astronomer, so perhaps a spacecraft should be named after her. That would seem incredibly suitable to me.
Okay. Any more questions in the room? Robert Massey.
Thank you. I was just going to say, actually, in terms of tributes, there was also an art installation we had here by our former artist in residence, Linda Laird, who helped with our bicentenary, and she created a fantastic work of images of the stars that Caroline added to Flamsteed's catalogue, and it was on display here, but it was in Slough because obviously the connection with Herschel's, but pretty sure she's going to set it up to be in Jodrell Bank in their new pavilion there as well, but I can't give you information on that, but look out for it.
And also I should add that the Royal Astronomical Society's archivist and I and another astronomer, a modern astronomer, collaborated on a podcast about Caroline Herschel to celebrate her birthday, and you can still access that online.
Further questions, comments?
Hi, my name's Alam Abdi. I wanted to ask, so during that time there was Caroline, who was a woman at that time, who with William did astronomy. But were there any other ladies who were also astronomers at that time that may have been kind of obscured by the other?
Oh yes, there's lots of them, and they're exactly the sort of people like me. People like me try to resurrect and give a more prominent role to. In terms of specifically of astronomy, the most famous person in England from roughly that period is John Flamsteed's wife, who collaborated with him in his observations, and rather similarly to Caroline Herschel, after he died, she was responsible for publishing the catalogue. So she played a very key role in astronomy. And also, particularly in Germany, there were a lot of astronomical women because astronomy was a craft and it was practiced at home. And so whether there were daughters or sons in the family, they were all trained up to collaborate with their parents and contribute to the family business. So there were a great many female astronomers in Germany, more than there were in England. But I think it was Lalande, one of the great French astronomers, compiled a book at the time, at the end of the 18th century, about all the female astronomers. So there were some in France and there were some in England, including Caroline Herschel. And there were also all the women who were called computers, who were carrying out all the calculations at home. So I think in trying to think about women in the past, it's better, rather than trying to find the equivalents of great men like Isaac Newton, you have to remember that women couldn't go to university. They did lead very restricted lives. On the other hand, a lot of science was practiced at home. There weren't the public laboratories, there weren't the university laboratories, there weren't the commercial laboratories that there are now. So men were working at home, which inevitably meant that a lot of women became involved. And women weren't necessarily involved in making great discoveries, but what they were very important for was things like translation, compiling notes, looking after collections, running museums, teaching, all the sort of things that contribute to the growth of science and are absolutely vital if science is going to spread, but that aren't usually included in stories of scientific discovery. So Isaac Newton supposedly sat under his apple tree and conceived the power of gravity. But when he published his book on the Principia, he was not the slightest bit interested in communicating his ideas. The book was in Latin, so only scholars could understand it. And he said he deliberately wrote it in very complicated maths because he didn't want, and this is quote, he didn't want to be bothered by little smatterers in mathematics. So the fact that his work became so widespread was due to a lot of other people, men as well as women, who translated his work and who wrote school and university textbooks or devised experiments which explained his ideas so they could be assimilated and absorbed. So I think if you think of the spread of science in that sort of way, then women play a far, far more prominent role than we've ever realized. And one of the best examples is a contemporary of Caroline Herschel, who was married to Lavoisier, the great chemist, and she was called Marie Pulser. And there's a collection of her own drawings at Cornell University in America. And those pictures show her in the laboratory, recording measurements. Her handwriting is all over the laboratory notebooks. When they got married, she was only 13. And the first thing she did was learn English. He didn't speak English so that she could communicate with people like Priestley and James Keir, who came over from England and Ireland. So she was absolutely central to his research. And she also drew all the diagrams that are in his big book on chemistry. But she doesn't get any credit, but she was absolutely crucial. It's just a different sort of role. Sorry, that's rather a long answer because it's one of my favorite subjects.
Thank you very much. That was fascinating, actually. And another question, perhaps the last one online.
And very appropriate as the last one. It's from Andrew Grant, and he says, not a question, just my thanks to all three speakers whose talks were very interesting.
Well, that's nice.
Well, perhaps that's the note on which to...
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
And I give notice that the next ANG open meeting of the Society will be on Friday, the 13th of January, 2023. And in the meantime, may I wish you all a very happy Christmas and a prosperous New Year.